Hello all and welcome to part 2 of tissues. So we've gone through how cells join. We're going to move on now to the actual tissue, the epithelial tissue. So when we're talking about epithelial tissue, we're talking about a liner, right? It's going to be single layer or many layers, so one or more layers of these epithelial cells. And they're usually sitting on some sort of base, right? And that underlying tissue is called basement membrane or basal lamina. Okay, so that's kind of what that tissue is sitting on, the base of it. And if you remember from the days of looking through the scope, you actually see that quite differently from the cells that make it up. So there's two types of these, the sheets of cells lining body surfaces or epithelia that is actually secretory. So that's different, is one that's actually sending out mucus, for example. So we'll look at those. This is the example of the cells. These are simple columnar cells that you can see here. And they're attaching to this bottom. Do you notice this section here looks different from these little columns that you see with their nuclei? So column and nucleus, but then down below we see something different. And that's the basement membrane that it's sitting on. It's that underlying tissue. That's all, just some vocabulary for you. So this tissue can be simple or stratified, we said, one layer or many. It can be sort of flattened, squamous. It can look more like a cube, which is square, or it can be these long columns, calling it columnar. And it does so many things. A function, when you think of function, it does a lot of stuff. It exchanges materials, it transports. It could be ciliated, which means it moves things from its cilia, like in your trachea. Something is caught, you cough. Those cilia are going to catch that dust particle or whatever is there. It shouldn't be. It can be protective, it can be secretory. Just think of any kind of liner. It's really a huge protective area. Okay. This is a nice drawing showing, again, apical membrane and basolateral membrane. And if you have a tight junction here, then substances won't be able to pass through. What they're going to have to do is actually come in this end and come out the other end. So that's really important in physiology when we're thinking of how things get transported in the cell. And it's going to be often through the apical membrane, because that gives to the hollow part of the organ or the lumen. And my mouse is really sensitive. That's going to happen. So it's substances then are going to pass from the lumen through the apical membrane, through the cell, travel, and out the other basolateral membrane. Okay. So what are some of the characteristics of this transporting epithelium? They have these membrane modifications at the apical membrane, right, that faces the lumen. They're going to have some sort of channel or something that's going to allow for that substance to pass through, whether it's glucose or sodium or any of those substances. And then the basolateral membrane is going to face the extracellular area. If it's a ciliated epithelium, I was giving the example of the trachea of your respiratory system, then look what an amazing photograph this is. It looks like a shag rug, right? So this top of this columnar cell is going to have these protrusions, these cilia that are going to be able to catch that dust, catch that little particle that you inhaled inadvertently. It's going to get stuck there. You push air through it and they're going to bend out, and out flies that little piece of toast, right? That crumb from the toast. So ciliated epithelium. There's also protective epithelium. So when you think of something being protected, you think of many layers. So the skin is the classic example. An epithelium, it's a coating, it's a covering. And look here, it's hard to see this, but it's layer. Here, layer. This is going... this is many layers of tissue that are coming up to the surface here of that skin. Wouldn't make sense to have just one layer only, right? A secretory epithelium. A secretory epithelium is a little gland, right? In it, it has a gland. And if you remember, goblet cells. This is a goblet cell that's embedded here in the intestine. If you want to keep things moving through the intestine, it's going to have to be moist. And in order for it to be moist, you need to have something secreted in there, some mucus pumped into it. It's going to be pumped and keeping things moving. Secretory cells always look like this. They look kind of granular. They look like bunches of little pebbles, and that's each one of those sections is secreting something. The pancreas looks like that because it's also a secretory organ. Okay, so that was to tell you about epithelium that secretes. It has glands, and those glands can be both exocrine or endocrine. So if it's exocrine, it needs to export it. It's not going to keep it close. So it needs some sort of duct. It's going to form a duct, and that's going to be able to put it out to the external environment of its environment. So secretory epithelium, like sweat, for example, has a duct. You lose water, and it's going to come up to the surface of the skin. So that's an exocrine gland. And an endocrine gland is going to release right into that region right next to it. It doesn't need a duct to take it somewhere else. It's going to be completely local. So that's an endocrine gland, and that's within the secretory epithelium. This is how those glands are made. So if you think of cell sitting on a connective tissue, this is the epithelium, right? And then they form more cells that make a little dip, right? So this dip is made by many cells, and then it's going to either differentiate into an exocrine gland. Look at this dip now has become a whole gland here that has a hollow section, and it's going to be able to export out of that hollow section, or an endocrine gland that just sort of has these secretory cells, and these cells will be able to deliver some chemical to this vicinity without having to move it to a different part of the body or out of that tissue, right? Exo, out, endo, in. All right, let's switch to connective tissues and think of those. Remember, the connective tissue is the catch-all. It's the one that's not neuron, it's the one that's not muscle, and it's not a liner. So it is vast. It can be very different. So highly variable is what I put on the slides. The cells, often are young cells and then mature cells. So we call them blasts when it's a young cell, a cyte when it's a mature cell, and a clast when it is a type of cell that is breaking something down. So let's think of it in terms of bone. An osteoblast is a new bone cell. An osteocyte is an adult, fully grown bone cell. An osteoclast is a cell that's able to release chemicals that break down bone. Self-recycling, that's what that is, clast. So it has the cells. It has other regions that are matrix that we talked about. What's in between cells, like collagen, elastin. Elastin is something that gives elasticity to your skin, for example. Fibrillin and fibronectin, all these different proteins that exist between cells in that tissue. So connective tissues are very different in that it's not so much cell attached together firmly, but more spread out with lots of matrix in between. That's what it's sort of the big picture of a connective tissue. So here, you're not seeing a row of cells, right? You're seeing a cell here, another cell there, and then all these other fibers and things in between. So lots of things that are in between is what you think of when you think of a connective tissue. This has a picture of elastic fibers, fibroblasts, collagen fibers, it's all in here. Different from a coating, a liner that can't leak, right? Okay, so that connective tissue could be dense, and a really good example of dense connective tissues are tendons and ligaments. And I wanted to remind you of what those were, not to get those confused. If it's a tendon, It's going to link skeletal muscle to a bone. So in the example here of the Achilles tendon, this, if I were to follow this up, this is going to a major muscle, the back of your leg, gastrocnemius, and it's coming back down here. It's turned into a tendon now. The end portion of it is a tendon, and it is attaching to a bone, to your calcaneus. So attaching a skeletal muscle to bone is a tendon. The ligament is joining, there's some pictures here, the ligament is joining bone to bone. So look at all these little foot bones, right? You have so many bones there that can't be flopping around. So the ligaments are attaching bones to bones. Those are all dense connective tissues. This is what it looks like under a microscope. Lots of fibers. So this waviness of fibers. And these little nuclei here are the cells. So what are you seeing? Not wall-to-wall, but lots of other substances, matrix in between. Supporting connective tissues. So here, cartilage and bone. What? They're a tissue? Yeah. Cartilage and bone are connective tissues. Cartilage is soft and flexible. It doesn't have a whole lot of blood supply. You have it everywhere. You have it at the end of your long bones. You have it cushioning those bones, those joints in the nose, in the ears, lots in the knee. Windpipe trachea also, right, has to remain open, so you need cartilage to keep it open. And bone, another connective tissue that is very calcified. It's secreted a lot of calcium and phosphate, hydroxyapatite, and all that is going to make it both strong and rigid. Connective tissue. This is, if you remember the picture of a bone, it's irrigated by this central canal. So here's where this artery comes, and it will irrigate all this little group of bones. So bone tissue looks really different. These are the cells, the darker areas, spread apart, not cell, spread apart, and in between matrix. That was a darkened area. Now in this area are the chondrocytes. So this is cartilage. It looks really different. These also, the cells can't be floating around because they're in a rigid substance, correct? So they have to have a little cave to live in. That cave's called lacuna. So there's a cave with its cells, and lots of matrix in between. Another connective tissue. And that was the last to tell you about connective tissue and epithelial tissues. And the other tissues, as I said, will be introduced to you while we look at those chapters on muscle and cardiac. Thanks for listening. Bye.